At 9:47 a.m. on October 14, 1944, Captain Thomas Earl Whitfield, 24 years old, 31 combat missions behind him, wrestles the control column of his Grumman F-6F-5 Hellcat as the instrument panel in front of him erupts in a hail of sparks. 18,000 feet above Leyte Gulf, the Philippines spread out beneath him. In a haze of green and gray, his oil pressure gauge needle drops from 65 to 12 in under 4 seconds. Smoke begins threading out of the engine cowling in a thin black ribbon that thickens with every heartbeat. The aircraft, his crew chief painted with the words Ohio Thunder across the nose, in white block letters over a coiled thunderbolt, has just taken a 20-millimeter round through the number 3-cylinder bank, and the machine that has carried him through 31 missions without so much as a scratch is now, mechanically speaking, beginning to die. He does not know it yet, but in the next 11 minutes, he will do something that no instructor in any training command ever taught him, something that violates the operating limits stenciled onto his own instrument panel, and something that will save 840 men. 840. That is not a mission parameter. That is not a number, typed onto a briefing board and forgotten by lunch. 840 is the ship's manifest of the attack transport USS Callahan Bay, anchored 11 miles behind him in the invasion anchorage, loaded with soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division who came ashore 2 days ago, and whose replacements, wounded, and support personnel are still aboard, waiting for the tide and the schedule to bring them in. 840 men who have families waiting in Ohio and Nebraska and Georgia, families who do not know that at this exact moment, 5 Japanese aircraft are inbound toward that ship at 340 miles an hour, and that Thomas Whitfield's damaged fighter, call sign Thunder 1, is the only thing in the sky standing between them and that anchorage. 840 men who 3 days ago were still stateside, writing letters home about the weather and the food, who have already survived 1 amphibious landing, under fire, and are simply trying to survive the wait for the next one. The number does not change, no matter how many times it is said. 840 men, and 1 damaged fighter standing between them and the water. The objective, before the engine failed, was simple: fly combat air patrol at 18,000 feet, intercept anything approaching the transport line, and turn it back or shoot it down. The enemy formation now closing from the northwest is 5 A6M-50s, part of a special attack element flying out of Cebu, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb slung beneath the fuselage. A Zero at cruise speed can close 8 miles in 90 seconds. 5 aircraft, if even 3 break through, can put over 750 kilograms of ordnance directly onto a single ship's deck. The math is simple and brutal. 1 successful hit amidships on a transport loaded with troops can kill or wound 200 men in the time it takes to say the number out loud. 5 zeros, 840 men. And Thomas Whitfield, alone, with an engine that is losing oil pressure by the second. He is not entirely alone in the air, even if he will fight this fight without a wingman at his shoulder. 3 other Hellcats from his flight, call signs Thunder 2, 3, and 4, are 22 miles south, engaged with a separate raid, unreachable by radio for the next several minutes. First Lieutenant Walter Dean Kowalski, 23, of Scranton, Pennsylvania. 6 confirmed kills, flies Thunder 2, and will not learn what happened up here until the debrief that night. Second Lieutenant Miguel Angel Reyes, 22, of Laredo, Texas, 3 confirmed kills, and a reputation for whistling over the radio when he is nervous, flies Thunder 3. First Lieutenant Daniel Patrick Coyne, 25, of Butte, Montana, the flight's oldest pilot, and the one who checks his fuel gauge out loud over the radio every 4 minutes, whether anyone asks him to or not, flies Thunder 4. Down on Callahan Bay's flight deck, Chief Petty Officer Earl James Whitcomb, 31, of Norfolk, Virginia, 12 years in naval service, watches the radar plot and calls the range down to the bridge in a flat, practiced voice that does not yet carry the fear that is building in his chest. He is not entirely without a roster of his own, even in a single-seat aircraft, because the 4 names painted in small stenciled letters beneath his canopy rail belong to the ground crew who keep Ohio Thunder flying, aviation machinist's mate. First Class Roy Hensley, 29, of Akron, Ohio, who has personally logged over 4,000 hours of engine maintenance and who checked this exact engine himself 11 hours before this flight. Aviation Ordnance Man, Second Class Frank Delgado, 24, of Fresno, California, who loaded these 2,400 rounds by hand before dawn and counts every belt twice. Aviation Metalsmith Third Class Harold Voss, 21, of Duluth, Minnesota, who patched the last flak damage to this aircraft's tail 3 weeks ago, and swears the rivets will hold to anything short of a direct hit. And Plane Captain Leonard Ito, 26, of Honolulu, Hawaii, who signed off on this aircraft as flight ready at 8:55 that morning, and will not learn until the debrief tonight exactly how close that engine came to failing him. 4 men on the ground, invisible to the enemy, who built the machine now carrying Thomas Whitfield through the fight of his life. Machine against machine, the numbers do not favor him, even before the engine failure. The Mitsubishi A6M50 weighs roughly 5,400 pounds, fully loaded, and can turn inside almost anything the Navy flies, its wing loading giving it a turning radius nearly 40% tighter than the Hellcats. The Hellcat, at over 9,000 pounds combat weight, cannot outturn a Zero, and has never been built to try. What it has instead is 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, a diving speed advantage of nearly 90 miles an hour, an armor plate behind the pilot's seat that the Zero does not carry. The Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine produces roughly 950 horsepower against the Hellcat's Pratt and Whitney R2800, rated at 2,000 horsepower on a good day, nearly double, which under normal circumstances gives Whitfield a climb rate and top-end speed advantage of close to 70 miles an hour. Wingspan tells a similar story. The Zero's 41-foot wing is built for lightness and turn radius. Sacrificing structural weight, the Hellcat's 42-foot wing does not sacrifice, which is why a Hellcat can absorb battle damage a Zero cannot, and still fly home. Whitfield's one true advantage over 5 aggressive, maneuvering enemy fighters was always going to be altitude and diving speed, the ability to strike from above and extend away before they can turn inside him. The engine failure has just taken half of that advantage and put it on fire. The temperature at 18,000 feet reads 11 degrees Fahrenheit outside the canopy, and even with the heater running, his breath fogs the inside of his oxygen mask in a rhythm he has stopped noticing after 31 missions. His fingers, in fleece-lined gloves, are already going numb at the tips, the particular numbness of altitude rather than cold. Through the canopy, ahead and slightly right, 5 specks resolve slowly into aircraft shapes, and behind him, smoke is now visible enough that he catches its reflection at the edge of his peripheral vision in the windscreen glass. The gauges glow a dull green-orange in the daylight, barely visible, and he checks the oil pressure needle one more time. 12 pounds and falling. Through the thick plexiglass of the canopy, visibility ahead is degraded by the thin smear of engine smoke curling back across the windscreen, cutting his forward field of view down to perhaps 60% of normal. Below him, 18,000 feet down, the ocean is a flat pewter sheet, broken only by the wakes of the invasion fleet. Small white threads on gray glass, too far away to offer any comfort at all. At 9:51, 4 minutes into the emergency, a second gauge betrays him. The oil temperature needle, which should sit comfortably in the green arc, has swung hard into the red, past 245 degrees, climbing. An engine run this hot with this little oil pressure has, by the manufacturer's own figures, somewhere between 6 and 11 minutes before catastrophic seizure. 11 minutes, at the outside, before the propeller stops turning entirely. At 9:52, Whitfield notices a second symptom stacking on top of the first. The engine has begun to run rough. A faint but unmistakable vibration traveling up through the control column and into his hands, roughly 250 revolutions per minute of variance where there should be none at all. The telltale sign of a cylinder losing compression as its oil supply starves. Where a healthy R2800 should hold steady at 2,200 revolutions per minute without complaint, this one now hunts between 1,900 and 2,100, unpredictable, shaving away any margin he might have had for a hard maneuver. Naval Air Training Command doctrine on this exact failure mode is not ambiguous. Any pilot experiencing oil pressure below 25 pounds, combined with oil temperature above 230 degrees, is to declare an emergency, disengage from combat, and make for the nearest suitable landing area or bailout point immediately. The manual estimates a 40% chance of complete engine seizure within 10 minutes under these exact readings, and a seized engine at 18,000 feet over water with 5 enemy fighters in the vicinity is close to a death sentence. Thunder 2, 3, and 4 are engaged and cannot break off without abandoning their own fight. The next nearest friendly aircraft is Marine Corsairs flying cover 40 miles south, at least 11 minutes out, even if they scrambled the instant they heard the call, which they have not, because Whitfield has not yet made it. His hand tightens on the control column, and for 3 full seconds he does nothing but watch the 5 aircraft grow larger against the pale morning sky. His heart rate, if anyone had thought to wire him to a monitor, would be reading somewhere close to 160 beats per minute. Over the radio, a voice crackles through, thin with distance. Reyes on Thunder 3, half caught between transmissions. Thunder 1, you're trailing smoke. Break off. Break off now. Whitfield keys his own mic once, his voice flat and unhurried, in a way his own ears do not quite recognize. Negative. 840 men on that ship don't get a second chance. He is not breaking off. If you want to see exactly how Thomas Whitfield pulled off what happens next, hit that like button. It genuinely helps us get these forgotten stories in front of more people who'd never otherwise hear them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because there are more stories just like this one waiting. Back to Thomas Whitfield, 18,000 feet over Leyte Gulf, engine dying, 5 zeros closing. What he does next is not in any flight manual. With the oil pressure bottoming out and the engine seconds from seizing under full power, Whitfield throttles back from 38 inches of manifold pressure to 22, cutting his own horsepower by nearly half in the middle of an active intercept, a decision that would earn him a failing grade in any training squadron in the country. The logic, worked out in under 2 seconds, is this. An engine running at reduced power generates less internal heat and less mechanical stress, buying time measured in minutes rather than seconds, at the direct cost of the speed and climb performance he would otherwise need to fight 5 zeros head-on. He trades power for time, gambling that a slower fight he survives beats a faster fight that kills him in 90 seconds. Reyes's voice comes back over the radio, sharp. "Thunder 1, you just cut your power in the middle of a bounce. What are you doing?" Whitfield's answer is 4 words. "Buying myself a minute." He works the mixture control at the same time, leaning the fuel-air ratio further than any checklist recommends for a struggling engine, another decision that runs directly against instinct. A rich mixture cools an engine under load, which is the textbook response to overheating, but it also demands more from a lubrication system that no longer has the pressure to deliver it. A slightly leaner mixture, counterintuitively, reduces the raw combustion heat generated inside each cylinder, even as it raises exhaust gas temperature, a trade Whitfield has seen exactly once before. In a training lecture he half remembers from 18 months earlier and never expected to use in combat. The oil temperature needle, which had been climbing steadily toward 260 degrees, slows its climb and holds for the moment at 251. The physics of it are ugly and real. At 22 inches of manifold pressure, the Hellcat's top speed drops by roughly 60 miles an hour, and its climb rate falls from 2,800 feet per minute to under 1,000, which by every rule of fighter combat should hand the advantage entirely to the more maneuverable, more lightly loaded zeros closing from below. It should fail. Every rational calculation says it fails. But a zero pilot trained to expect a diving, full-power bounce from above will misjudge his intercept geometry against a target suddenly flying 60 miles an hour slower than expected. And that misjudgment, worth perhaps 2 or 3 seconds of confusion, is the only opening Whitfield is going to get. There is no crew in the traditional sense aboard a single-seat Hellcat, but the coordination that saves Thomas Whitfield's life in the next several minutes is built entirely from the 3 men flying with him 22 miles away, who hear enough over the radio to understand what is happening and act without being ordered to. Kowalski, on Thunder 2, breaks off his own engagement the instant he hears Whitfield's transmission and turns north at full military power, accepting that his own target will escape in order to close the distance. Coyne, on Thunder 4, keys his radio and begins relaying Whitfield's position and altitude to the ship's radar plot every 15 seconds without being asked, giving Chief Whitcomb a running fix he would not otherwise have. Reyes, still nearest the original fight, breaks contact 2 minutes behind Kowalski once his own target is confirmed destroyed and turns north as well. None of it is coordinated by radio call or standing order. It is 3 men who have flown together for 11 months, reading a crisis correctly and converging on it without discussion. Kowalski's throttle sits firewalled for the entire 4-minute transit. Engine temperatures climbing into territory his own instructors would have flagged, a risk he accepts without comment because the alternative, arriving a minute late, is not one he is willing to live with. Reyes trims his own fuel margin closer than regulation allows, calculating that he can afford the risk of a tight return leg if it buys him even 90 extra seconds in the fight. It is the kind of math none of them would recommend to a student pilot, and the kind of math every one of them makes without hesitation for each other. The numbers, checked one more time before contact, read like this: 211 gallons of fuel remaining out of the 250 he started with, translating to roughly 54 minutes of flight time at reduced power. 2,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, untouched. 11 miles of open water between his position and Callahan Bay's deck. The 5 Zeros are now 4 miles out and closing at a combined rate of nearly 500 miles an hour. First contact comes fast. Whitfield hears them before he clearly sees them, the specific high snarl of 5 Sakai radial engines, cutting through the thinner sound of his own damaged motor. And then muzzle flash blinks from the lead aircraft's wing roots a half-second before he identifies its silhouette. It arrives from his 10 o'clock, slightly low, closing at an estimated 290 miles an hour combined rate, and he has perhaps 4 seconds inside its effective firing envelope before it passes. Tracers stitch the air 11 yards off his left wingtip, close enough that he can see individual rounds tumble past the canopy, and then the lead Zero is gone beneath him, its pass ending without a hit on either side. The clock position calls come fast now, 10 o'clock, then 2 o'clock high, then 6 o'clock low. Each one a fresh injection of adrenaline into a body already running on fumes, and the closure rate on each pass never drops below 250 miles an hour combined, giving Whitfield somewhere between 3 and 5 seconds of actual firing window per engagement, no more. The reversal comes almost immediately. Lieutenant Junior Grade Hideki Sakamoto, 26, flying with the 341st Kokutai out of Cebu, has been tracking Whitfield's smoke trail from 6 miles out since before the American pilot ever saw his formation, the black ribbon pouring from Ohio Thunder's cowling visible against the pale sky. From a distance, no clean aircraft could be spotted at. Sakamoto is not a fool and not a fanatic in the way American propaganda like to draw his kind. He is a professional with 4 confirmed kills of his own, flying the doctrine he was trained to fly, using the wounded American's own damage against him with textbook precision. He calls his formation into a loose line astern pursuit, content to let his 4 wingmen take the first passes and wear the target down, while he holds the ideal firing position in reserve. It is not Whitfield who scores first. On the second pass, as a Zero cuts across his nose at 800 yards, First Lieutenant Coyne, arriving 4 minutes ahead of schedule at full power, with fuel gauge be damned, puts a 2-second burst, roughly 60 rounds, across the Zero's wing root and engine cowling from 600 feet, and the aircraft's port wing folds upward at the attachment point, before the whole airframe tumbles into a flat, smoking spin toward the water. 1 down, 4 remaining, and Whitfield's fuel gauge now reads 194 gallons. The cost comes almost immediately after. A burst of 20-millimeter cannon fire from Sakamoto's own aircraft, fired from an angle Whitfield never sees coming, tears through Ohio Thunder's right wing near the aileron hinge, and for 3 full seconds the Hellcat rolls, uncommanded to the right before Whitfield wrestles it level, having lost an estimated 40% of his roll authority on that side. His hydraulic pressure gauge, already stressed by the earlier damage, drops to 0. The aircraft that once turned crisply on command now answers sluggishly, heavily, like something wounded and reluctant. Whitfield estimates, from the way the stick fights him in his right hand, that he has lost somewhere close to 40% of his roll authority on that side, meaning every turn to the right now takes nearly twice the control input it should. Precious fractions of a second he does not have to spare in a turning fight against aircraft that can already outturn him on their best day. The fuel gauge reads 161 gallons. Ammunition, checked against his count of expended bursts, sits at roughly 1,700 rounds. The honest arithmetic, runs silently in the 11 seconds between attacks, says he has perhaps 22 minutes of flight time left in a badly damaged airframe against 3 remaining Zeros who have not yet begun to coordinate. Every number on that list argues for disengaging now, diving for the water, and running for the nearest friendly deck. Instead, the 3 surviving Zeros execute exactly the maneuver Sakamoto has been holding them for, splitting into a high, low, and level attack from 3 separate bearings simultaneously, a classic killing box that leaves no direction. Whitfield can turn without exposing his tail to at least 1 gun. Whitfield counts the seconds, the way Hensley once taught him to count a rough-running engine, silently, under his breath. 1 Mississippi closes the high aircraft to firing range, 2 Mississippi brings the low one into position, and by 3 Mississippi, whichever way he turns, at least 1 set of guns will have a solution on him. There is no 4th Mississippi in this equation. There is only the decision he has to make before the 3rd one arrives. Coyne's voice comes over the radio, urgent. Thunder 1, you're boxed. You need to break south right now. I can cover you. He is not wrong. Every rational calculation says the same thing Coyne is saying. But Whitfield runs a different arithmetic. In the 4 seconds he has to decide, 3 surviving Zeros, each still carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, mean 3 more chances at Callahan Bay's deck tomorrow, or the day after, or the week after, against some other pilot who might not get as lucky. He thinks, in the space of a breath, of a radio man from Nebraska who keeps his sister's letters folded in his shirt pocket, a deckhand from Georgia who cannot stop talking about his mother's peach cobbler, and a young ensign from Maine who carries his fiancée's photograph tucked inside his helmet band, all 3 of them somewhere below him right now on that ship. Not because he is fearless, but because he is terrified, and does it anyway. Not because he wants a medal, but because he cannot live with himself if he runs. Not because he is superhuman, but because he is, in this exact moment, deeply and perfectly human. He keys his mic. Negative, Danny. Staying in it. What he does next violates the same principle of energy management that every one of his instructors drilled into him from his first day of flight school. Never trade your remaining airspeed for a maneuver you cannot recover from. Whitfield does exactly that. With the low zero closing to firing range beneath him, he hauls the nose up hard, bleeding speed from 190 miles an hour to barely 80 in under 6 seconds. A deliberate stall he has never once practiced in combat, standing the Hellcat on its tail, with the stall warning horn screaming and the altimeter briefly frozen. For 1.5 seconds, hanging at the top of the maneuver, with his own aircraft nearly motionless, he is theoretically the easiest target in the sky. But the low zero, committed to a firing pass calculated against a target moving at 190 miles an hour, overshoots beneath him entirely. Its own geometry, destroyed by physics, its pilot never saw coming. And as Whitfield's nose drops through the top of the stall, he is looking directly down the Zero's spine from 400 feet. He fires for 1.5 seconds, roughly 90 rounds, and watches the Zero's engine erupt in a sheet of orange flame before it noses over and spirals down, trailing black smoke into the Gulf below. 2 down, 3 remaining, and one of them is Sakamoto, who has watched 2 of his wingmen die in the last 90 seconds and adjusts accordingly, no longer content to hold position in reserve. The 2 remaining junior pilots, rattled and undisciplined without their leader's direct control, break off their coordinated attack and dive for altitude separation. And it is Kowalski, arriving finally at the fight after 4 minutes of full-power flying, who catches one of them in a shallow turn and puts a 3-second burst into its fuselage from 400 yards, sending it down in flames off Whitfield's left side. 3 down, 2 remaining, one of them fleeing north, the other still Sakamoto. The remaining junior pilot, alone now and thoroughly outmatched, breaks north for Cebu and does not return, leaving Sakamoto to fight the last minutes of the engagement without support of any kind, a situation his own doctrine never anticipated and his training never rehearsed. Sakamoto is, by any honest measure, the best pilot in the sky that morning, patient where his wingmen were not. And he has learned something in the last 90 seconds that his dead subordinates never had the chance to learn. This wounded American doesn't fly by the rules a damaged aircraft is supposed to fly by. He attacks from directly astern and slightly high, the one angle Whitfield's shredded aileron and dead hydraulics genuinely cannot answer. Closing to within 200 feet before opening fire, cannon rounds walking up Ohio Thunder's fuselage and shattering the rear canopy frame 18 inches behind Whitfield's head. It is Reyes, arriving last and lowest on fuel, who forces his own turret authority past its rated limits, wrenching his guns onto a deflection shot no gunnery manual would call reasonable, and puts the last of his ammunition, the final 40 rounds in his belt, directly into Sakamoto's engine from an angle that is equal parts skill and desperate luck. The Zero does not explode. It simply stops flying, engine dead, and glides downward in a long, controlled arc before disappearing into the water 3 miles off Whitfield's wing. Somewhere in that cockpit is a 26-year-old man who has flown 4 confirmed missions to Whitfield's 31, someone's son, someone's brother, doing exactly the duty he was trained to do. War does not leave room for that grief. Not yet. Silence follows. The strange ringing silence after sustained combat noise, broken only by the labored, uneven sound of Ohio Thunder's own engine. Whitfield runs the numbers one last time. 138 gallons of fuel remain. Ammunition, 610 rounds. Altitude, 11,200 feet, and descending on its own. The damaged engine no longer capable of sustained climb. Callahan Bay sits 9 miles to the southeast. The rate of descent, uncommanded and steady, reads 600 feet per minute. The arithmetic, done honestly, says he will run out of usable altitude, roughly 4 miles short of the ship, over open water, in an aircraft with a hydraulic system reading 0, and a right aileron that no longer fully answers. The landing that follows is not a landing so much as a controlled failure managed one number at a time. 10,000 feet. 118 gallons remaining. More time than fuel will ultimately matter for. 9,200 feet. Airspeed steady at 140. 8,000 feet. 109 gallons. The landing gear handle, when he throws it, produces only a single hydraulic thunk on the left side, the right main gear refusing to extend on a system with no pressure left to force it down. 4,000 feet. Airspeed 130, then 115. The engine, starved and overheated for the better part of 26 minutes, finally ceases entirely at 900 feet. The propeller windmilling to a stop in eerie silence, leaving only the wind across the canopy and his own breathing inside the mask. 600 feet. 500. Whitfield picks a stretch of water 400 yards off Callahan Bay's port bow, close enough for a launch to reach him inside of 2 minutes, and brings the crippled Hellcat down in a long, flat glide, touchdown speed roughly 95 miles an hour on the water with one gear leg still folded. The aircraft skips once, slews hard to the right on the collapsed gear, and slides nearly 60 yards before coming to rest half submerged. Nose down, the tail lifted at an angle above the waves. No fire, no explosion. Just the sound of water rushing in through the shattered canopy, and the knowledge, arriving slowly through the adrenaline, that he was still alive to hear it. A launch from Callahan Bay reached him within 4 minutes, commanded by Chief Petty Officer Whitcomb himself, who had spent the last 26 minutes calling range and bearing off the ship's radar plot, and refused to hand the boat off to anyone else once the order came to retrieve the pilot. Whitfield was pulled from the sinking cockpit with a fractured left wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and mild frostbite across 3 fingers on his right hand, injuries that would keep him grounded for 6 weeks but nothing worse. The ship's doctor, examining him 20 minutes later, noted in the medical log that the pilot's pulse, remarkably, had already returned to a resting rate by the time he reached sickbay, as if whatever had carried him through those 6 minutes had simply switched itself off the moment his boots touched the launch deck. Kowalski landed back aboard with 11 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for a second approach had the first one failed. Coyne, who had flown the longest and fastest to reach the fight, needed his own aircraft towed clear of the flight deck after his landing gear, strained from the hard cross-country dash, buckled on rollout. A senior intelligence officer aboard the escort carrier Manila Bay, reviewing the after-action report 2 days later, initially logged the account of a single damaged fighter downing 5 enemy aircraft with visible skepticism, until independent radar logs from 2 separate ships and gun camera film recovered from Thunder 4's aircraft corroborated the sequence nearly exactly as reported. Captain Thomas Whitfield was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that morning, along with a promotion to major within the year. Reyes, Kowalski, and Coyne each received the Air Medal, and their squadron received a unit citation for the engagement. But the number that mattered most to every man who flew that patrol was simpler than any medal. Every soldier aboard the USS Callahan Bay came home from that anchorage without a single loss. Thomas Whitfield went home to Waverly, Ohio, after the war and spent 31 years as an aircraft mechanic, specializing, his coworkers liked to joke, in engines everyone else had already given up on. He married in 1946, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about October 14, 1944, except once a year, quietly, to the men who had been there. Daniel Coyne returned to Butte, Montana, and worked in the copper mines for the rest of his career, telling anyone who asked that he had already experienced real fear once, and it had made the rest of life feel considerably smaller. Miguel Reyes went home to Laredo, Texas, became a high school shop teacher, and kept a single photograph of Ohio Thunder taped inside his classroom desk drawer for 40 years. Walter Kowalski returned to Scranton, worked as a railroad dispatcher, and named his first son Thomas. Roy Hensley, the machinist's mate who had checked Ohio Thunder's engine 11 hours before it nearly killed its pilot, spent the rest of his career at a commercial airline, training a generation of mechanics to trust their own hands over a checklist when the two disagreed. Frank Delgado went home to Fresno and ran a hardware store for 30 years, telling customers who asked about the faded Navy tattoo on his forearm only that he had once loaded ammunition for a pilot who needed every single round to count. And the 3 men below decks that morning lived out the futures that had briefly flickered through Whitfield's mind in the middle of the fight. The radio man from Nebraska went home and watched his sister's children grow up. The letters he had carried finally answered in person rather than by mail. The deckhand from Georgia spent the rest of his life running his mother's peach cobbler recipe at his own diner outside Savannah. The young ensign from Maine married the woman whose photograph he had carried inside his helmet band, and returned the small square of fabric she had once given him for luck, folded, decades later, into her hands. The 4 pilots met at reunions 11 times over the following 4 decades, gathering in VFW halls and backyard cookouts across 4 states, and by every account from the men who were there, they talked about nearly everything except that morning over Leyte Gulf. They talked about the weather, and their children, and the cars they drove, and old squadron gossip decades stale, and every single time, without ever discussing it as a rule, October 14, 1944, simply did not come up. It stayed private between them, honored more by the silence than it ever could have been by retelling. 4 men who understood something about that morning that no reunion toast could ever quite put into words. Thomas Whitfield passed away in 1996 at the age of 76. His obituary in the local Ohio paper mentioned his naval service in 2 sentences and said nothing of the 5 zeros, the burning engine, or the 840 men aboard a transport ship whose names he never learned. This account has been reconstructed as a dramatized narrative from the surviving details of pilots who flew missions like his, built to honor the kind of split-second, physics-defying decisions real airmen made in situations very much like this one. One surviving photograph exists from that squadron, taken 3 weeks before the engagement. 4 young men standing in front of their aircraft in flight gear, squinting into the Pacific sun, grinning, entirely unaware of what was still ahead of them. It hangs today in a small aviation museum outside Dayton, Ohio, 1 frame among hundreds, and most visitors who pass it never learn what these 4 men did on a Saturday morning in October of 1944. But we know. And stories like this deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, that like button genuinely matters, because every single like tells YouTube to put this in front of more people who would otherwise never hear it, and helps rescue stories like this one from dusty file cabinets and forgotten archives. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we bring you a forgotten story of real heroism like this one every single day. And down in the comments, tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight, whether that's the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, because you're not just watching this story. You're part of what keeps it alive. At 9:47 on the morning of October 14, 1944, 1 wounded fighter and 1 determined pilot stood between 5 enemy aircraft and 840 men. He destroyed 5 of them before his own engine finally gave out beneath him. He carried that morning quietly for the rest of his life, in a small town in Ohio, alongside 3 other men scattered across Pennsylvania, Texas, and Montana, who never forgot it either. Roy Hensley in Akron, Frank Delgado in Fresno. 4 ground crewmen and 4 pilots, 8 men in total, bound together by 6 minutes over open water that none of them ever fully talked about again. And now, through this story, what they did that morning lives on. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.